Every single hour, another one rolled off the assembly line. Think about that for a moment. 60 minutes, and there it was, another B-24 Liberator gleaming under the factory lights, ready to join the war effort. The production numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. By the time the Second World War finally ground to its bloody conclusion, American factories had manufactured 18,500 of these heavy bombers. It was a feat of industrial might that the world had never witnessed before, and in many ways it represented everything America wanted to project about itself during those dark years. Power, efficiency, unstoppable momentum. But there's another number that haunts this story, one that doesn't appear on production charts or in triumphant newsreels: 30,000. That's how many American airmen died in B-24s. 30,000 young men who climbed through the hatches of these bombers, settled into their positions, and never made it home. To put that in perspective, imagine an entire small city, every person in it, just gone, wiped away. That's not some abstract figure you can brush past. Each one of those 30,000 was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband or father or friend. Each one had a name, a face, dreams about what they'd do when the war ended. And they all vanished into the sky, consumed by a machine that was supposed to win the war. The aircraft itself carried a name that dripped with irony. They called it the Liberator. The very word suggests freedom, rescue, salvation. And in many ways, the B-24 did liberate. It helped break the stranglehold of German submarines in the Atlantic. It carried the fight to the heart of Nazi Germany and across the vast Pacific. But for the men who flew inside it, the Liberator often became something else entirely, something far darker. It became a trap, a coffin with wings, a gamble with death at 30,000 feet. Understanding why this happened requires going back to the beginning, to the late 1930s, when storm clouds were gathering over Europe and military planners in Washington were starting to worry. The United States had a bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and it was good, reliable, sturdy. But there was a growing sense that good might not be good enough. The Army Air Corps wanted something more. They wanted greater range, the ability to strike deeper into enemy territory. They wanted more speed to evade fighters. They wanted a bigger payload to carry more destruction. The B-17 couldn't do all of that, at least not well enough. So the challenge went out to Consolidated Aircraft, a company that had been building planes since the 1920s. The engineers there got to work, and what they came up with was designated Model 32. It would soon be known to the world as the B-24 Liberator, and on paper, it looked absolutely revolutionary. The design featured a deep, spacious fuselage that could accommodate an enormous bomb load. It had twin tail fins instead of the single tail you'd see on most aircraft of that era. But the real innovation, the thing that set it apart, was the wing. They called it the Davis Wing, named after aeronautical engineer David Davis, who had developed this particular airfoil design. Unlike conventional wings, which were thick and relatively stubby, the Davis Wing was long, slender, and incredibly efficient. The aerodynamic properties were remarkable. This wing generated extraordinary lift while producing minimal drag. What that meant in practical terms was range. The B-24 could fly farther than any heavy bomber before it. It could cross oceans. It could reach targets that had previously been safe from American bombs simply because they were too far away. Military planners looked at the specifications and saw gold. Engineers admired the elegance of the design. By 1941, before the United States had even officially entered the war, the B-24 was moving into full-scale production. And this wasn't just one factory churning out a few planes here and there. This was American industry at its most ambitious. 5 massive manufacturing plants roared to life. The most famous was Willow Run, a facility built by Henry Ford outside Detroit. The place was enormous, over 3 million square feet under one roof. Ford applied the same assembly line principles he'd pioneered with automobiles to the production of heavy bombers. Workers moved from station to station. Components arrived in precise sequence. The whole operation was choreographed like a massive industrial ballet. At peak production, the numbers were almost unbelievable. Every single hour, a complete B-24 rolled out of Willow Run. Not parts, not sub-assemblies, but a finished bomber ready to fly. Nothing like it had ever been accomplished before. The sky was being armed faster than anyone had thought possible. Looking at the specifications, you could see why there was so much optimism. The B-24 was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, each one producing 1,200 horsepower. That was serious muscle. It carried a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and 6 gunners scattered throughout the aircraft. Those gunners manned 50 caliber machine guns positioned in turrets. There was a nose turret, a tail turret, waist guns on either side of the fuselage, and a ball turret on the belly. The idea was to create a flying fortress, though that name was already taken by the B-17, so they had to settle for describing it as a heavily defended bomber that could protect itself from enemy fighters. The bomb bays were cleverly designed with roller doors instead of the traditional hinged doors you'd see on other aircraft. This reduced drag, keeping the bomber faster even when the bays were open. Maximum payload was 12,000 pounds of bombs, enough to devastate a factory complex, obliterate a rail yard, or reduce a city block to rubble. Armour plating protected vital crew stations. Everything about it seemed perfect, seemed unstoppable. But perfection is a dangerous illusion, especially in warfare. Even in these early days, there were signs, small things that should have raised concerns but got overlooked in the rush to production. The crew compartments were cramped, much more so than in the B-17. Moving through the interior of a B-24 meant navigating tight claustrophobic spaces. The bomb bay had to be crossed using a narrow catwalk, maybe 9 inches wide. That doesn't sound too bad until you remember that crews wore heavy flight suits, parachutes, and equipment. They had to cross this catwalk in turbulent conditions, sometimes in the dark, sometimes while the aircraft was taking enemy fire. It was treacherous. The emergency hatches were small, oddly positioned. Getting out of a B-24 in an emergency was difficult under the best circumstances. If the aircraft was on fire, if it was spinning, if crew members were wounded, escape became nearly impossible. But in those heady days before America's full entry into the war, these concerns didn't seem to matter much. What mattered was production numbers, range statistics, bomb tonnage. What mattered was the vision of fleets of these bombers darkening the skies over enemy territory, carrying democracy and destruction in equal measure. The Liberator was going to be America's iron fist, the weapon that would pound the Axis powers into submission. That was the promise anyway. That was what the propaganda said, what the planners believed, what the factory workers were told as they riveted panels and installed engines. But promises made in offices and factories have a way of colliding with reality once the shooting starts. And when the B-24 Liberator finally met the brutal reality of combat, when it flew into skies filled with flak and enemy fighters, the truth began to emerge. The flaws hidden in that beautiful Davis wing, buried in the cramped fuselage, lurking in the fuel system, those flaws would be paid for not in dollars or production delays, but in blood. The Liberator's first real test didn't come over the cities and factories of occupied Europe. It came over the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain was in desperate straits. German U-boats, submarines operating in coordinated wolf packs, were systematically destroying the convoys that kept Britain alive. Ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, everything Britain needed to continue fighting, were being sent to the bottom faster than they could be replaced. The situation was becoming critical. The problem was coverage. Aircraft could patrol the waters close to North America. Aircraft based in Britain and Iceland could patrol the waters on the European side of the Atlantic. But there was a gap, hundreds of miles of ocean right in the middle where no aircraft could reach. The planes simply didn't have the range. This gap became known as the Black Pit, and it was a killing ground. U-boats knew that once convoys entered this area, they were safe from air attack. They could surface, take their time, pick off ships one by one. The B-24 changed this equation. That Davis wing, with its extraordinary efficiency, gave the Liberator the range to cross the Atlantic, to patrol areas that had previously been beyond reach. Liberators began flying long-range maritime patrols, hunting submarines. The Black Pit closed. U-boats suddenly found themselves under attack even in the middle of the ocean. They had to stay submerged, which reduced their speed and effectiveness. The Battle of the Atlantic began to turn in favour of the Allies, and the Liberator played a significant role in that victory. But while maritime patrol was important, it wasn't the primary mission planners had in mind for the B-24. They wanted it to bomb Germany. They wanted it to join the great strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to destroy the Nazi war machine from the air. Starting in 1942 and accelerating through 1943, B-24s began arriving in England. They joined the 8th Air Force, the massive American air armada that would spend the next 3 years pounding Germany around the clock. The British bombed by night, the Americans bombed by day. Together they were going to reduce the Third Reich to rubble. 14 bomb groups equipped with B-24s took up station in England. At first, American commanders envisioned a beautiful symmetry. B-17S and B-24s would fly together in massive formations, a single overwhelming force of heavy bombers that would blast through enemy defences. On paper, it made perfect sense. In practice, it was a disaster. The problem was that the two aircraft were fundamentally different. The B-17 flew slower, steadier. It was easier to handle, easier to keep in tight formation. The B-24, thanks to that efficient Davis wing, was faster, but it was also more temperamental. The controls were heavier, requiring more physical effort from the pilots. Keeping a B-24 in tight formation required constant attention, constant adjustment. The pilots described it as exhausting. Their hands would cramp around the control yoke. Their shoulders would burn from the effort. They'd have to trade off, switching positions every 15 minutes just to keep from losing control of the aircraft. When you tried to mix B-17 and B-24s in the same formation, the differences became impossible to manage. The Liberators would surge ahead. The fortresses would fall behind. The formations would fragment. And fragmented formations were death sentences. The whole theory of strategic bombing depended on aircraft staying close together, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire from their machine guns. A tight formation was a fortress in the sky. A scattered formation was a collection of individual targets. Military commanders quickly realized they couldn't keep the two types together. The Liberators were separated into their own divisions, their own formations. They flew from England, later from bases in North Africa and Italy, striking targets all across occupied Europe. The range advantage that had made the B-24 so valuable in the Atlantic proved valuable over Europe as well. The Liberator could reach targets the B-17 couldn't, could strike deeper into Germany, could hit oil fields in the Balkans and industrial centres in Eastern Europe. But that reach came with a price, a terrible price that would be measured in burning aircraft and dead airmen. Because the Liberator, for all its advantages, was not a flying fortress. It couldn't absorb punishment the way a B-17 could. The controls were heavy, yes, but they were also fragile. The hydraulics could fail. The control cables could snap. When that happened at 25,000 feet with enemy fighters swarming and flak bursting all around, there was no recovery. The aircraft would fall out of control, spinning toward the earth, and the crew would have seconds to realize they were going to die. Formation flying was essential for survival, but it was torture in a B-24. The pilots fought the controls constantly. Their muscles screamed. Some would develop chronic injuries, torn rotator cuffs, damaged backs, from the sheer physical effort of keeping the bomber steady. And even then, keeping formation was harder in a Liberator than in a fortress. The B-24 would slip, would drift. Gaps would open in the defensive formation. And German fighter pilots, experienced hunters who'd been fighting in these skies for years, They learned to recognize the differences between the two American bombers. They learned which one was vulnerable. When Luftwaffe fighters attacked a mixed stream of bombers, they went for the B-24s first. The Liberators were faster, yes, but they couldn't turn as well. They couldn't take hits as well. And when hits came, when cannon shells and machine gun bullets tore into a B-24, the results were often catastrophic. The fuel tanks were supposed to be self-sealing, lined with a rubber compound that would swell and close holes when punctured. But the sealing wasn't perfect, not like it was on the B-17. Fuel would leak. Fuel would spray. And when fuel met tracer rounds or hot metal or electrical sparks, it ignited. Fire was the nightmare every B-24 crew lived with. The thin aluminum skin of the fuselage provided no protection. When fire broke out, it spread with terrifying speed. The crew had seconds, maybe, to bail out. But getting out of a burning B-24 was nearly impossible. The hatches were small. Men wearing parachutes and heavy flight gear had to squeeze through. The bomb bay catwalk, that narrow 9-inch strip, had to be crossed while the aircraft was spinning, burning, breaking apart. Many crews never made it out. They went down with the aircraft, trapped inside as it plunged toward earth or sea. The flak was another horror. Anti-aircraft artillery, thousands of guns positioned around every strategic target in Europe, fired shells that burst at preset altitudes, filling the air with red-hot shrapnel. A B-17 might take a flak hit and keep flying. The damage would be severe, maybe an engine knocked out, maybe holes in the wings, but often it could limp home. The B-24 was less forgiving. Those beautiful Davis wings, so efficient in creating lift, were also fragile. They couldn't handle the stress loads that thicker wings could absorb. A single well-placed flak burst could shear off a wing spar. The wing would fold, the aircraft would disintegrate in mid-air. 10 men would cease to exist in an instant, their bodies scattered across the sky along with chunks of aluminum and steel. And the Liberators flew lower than the Fortresses, typically. The speed advantage meant they could afford to come in at slightly lower altitudes in some situations. But lower altitude meant more concentrated flak. The anti-aircraft gunners had an easier time tracking and hitting aircraft that were closer. The flak bursts were denser, more accurate. Every mission into Germany became a gauntlet. Black puffs of smoke would blossom around the formation. Each one represented a shell that had just exploded. Each explosion threw out thousands of pieces of shrapnel. All it took was one piece, one jagged chunk of metal travelling at hundreds of miles per hour, hitting the right spot. The losses mounted. One mission might see a dozen B-24s fail to return. Another might lose 50. The crews kept flying because they had to. They had orders. They had a mission count to complete before they could go home. Most crews were assigned 25 missions initially, later increased to 30, then 35. Each mission was a separate roll of the dice. The odds were simple and brutal. About half of all airmen who flew on heavy bombers over Europe would be killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tour. Half. Those aren't odds. That's a coin flip between life and death, repeated over and over. The men spoke quietly among themselves about the terror of it. They'd watch a Liberator next to them take a direct hit from flak. The aircraft would shudder, lurch, and then explode. Burning debris would rain down. Parachutes might blossom, 1 or 2 if the crew was lucky. Usually there were no parachutes, the men would just be gone. And the survivors would tighten their formation, close the gap, and continue toward the target, because that's what they'd been trained to do. That's what the mission required. In the Pacific Theatre, the Liberator found a different kind of war but similar perils. The vast distances across the Pacific Ocean made the B-24's range invaluable. From bases scattered across tiny islands, Liberators would fly 1,000-mile missions to strike Japanese shipping, naval bases, airfields. The theatre was so enormous that aircraft would sometimes fly for hours without seeing anything but ocean. Navigation became critical. Getting lost out here meant ditching in the sea, and that was essentially a death sentence. Because when a B-24 had to ditch in the water, the deep fuselage became a fatal flaw. The aircraft was never designed for water landings. When it hit the waves, the belly would slam down hard. The impact was tremendous. The fuselage would crack, buckle. Water would pour in immediately. The B-24 would sink fast, sometimes in less than a minute. Crews had to get out instantly, but they were stunned from the impact, disoriented, sometimes injured. Many drowned, still strapped into their seats. Those who made it out faced a different nightmare. Adrift in the Pacific, thousands of miles from anywhere, hoping someone would find them before dehydration, exposure, or sharks finished them off. Some were found, many weren't. The mechanical reliability issues plagued Pacific operations as well. Engines would fail without warning. Oil systems would malfunction. Hydraulic lines would rupture. These weren't just inconveniences. When you're flying over empty ocean and an engine quits, you start losing altitude. Lose too much altitude, and you're in the water. The crews learned to nurse damaged aircraft along, coaxing every mile they could, praying the remaining engines would hold out. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Japanese fighters added another layer of danger. The Zero and other Japanese fighters were agile, maneuverable, deadly. They'd swarm damaged bombers, picking off stragglers. The B-24's gunners would fight back with everything they had, their .50 caliber machine guns hammering away, but often it wasn't enough. A determined fighter attack could shred a Liberator in seconds. Despite all of this, despite the losses and the terror and the mechanical failures, the Liberators kept flying. Factories kept producing them. Crews kept climbing aboard. Because there was a war to win, and this was the tool they'd been given. But the true test, the mission that would define the B-24's legacy in the most tragic way possible, was still to come. It would happen over the oil fields of Romania, in a city called Ploiești, and it would become one of the most catastrophic raids in the entire history of aerial warfare. August 1st, 1943. Dawn broke over the North African desert, and across multiple airfields in Libya, engines coughed to life. 178 B-24 Liberators, loaded with bombs and fuel, began their takeoff rolls. The sound must have been incredible, hundreds of engines roaring at full throttle, wings heavy with explosive ordnance, dust billowing in massive clouds. Each aircraft carried 10 men. Do the math. That's 1,780 airmen climbing into the sky, heading toward a target most of them didn't even know about yet. The crews had been told they were flying to Palestine. A deception. The real target was Ploiești, Romania, and the massive oil refineries located there. These weren't just any refineries. They were the heart of Nazi Germany's oil supply. Intelligence estimates suggested that Ploiești provided 60% of Germany's crude oil. Destroy these refineries, and you could cripple the German war machine. Tanks without fuel don't move. Aircraft without fuel don't fly. The strategic logic was simple and compelling. One devastating raid could potentially shorten the war, save countless lives, bring victory closer. But there were problems, enormous problems, starting with the simple fact that Ploiești was one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. The Germans knew exactly how important these refineries were. They'd ringed the area with anti-aircraft guns, hundreds of them. They'd positioned fighter squadrons nearby. They'd installed smoke generators to obscure the refineries if attacked. This wasn't some lightly defended target. This was a fortress. The plan called for a daylight raid at extremely low altitude. The bombers would come in just above the treetops, under the radar, hopefully achieving surprise. They'd strike fast, drop their bombs from minimum altitude, and get out before the defences could fully respond. It was audacious, it was dangerous, it was probably insane. But the potential payoff seemed worth the risk, at least to the planners who wouldn't be flying the mission. Secrecy was supposed to be absolute. The crews didn't know the real target until the very last moment. Maps were kept sealed. Even the route was classified. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially big secrets involving hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men. German intelligence had gotten wind of the operation. Not all the details, perhaps, but enough. Enough to alert defences, to put fighters on standby, to prepare for something big coming their way. The first disaster struck almost immediately. A B-24 named Wongo Wongo, piloted by the deputy commander, suffered mechanical failure shortly after takeoff. The aircraft pitched up, stalled, and plunged into the Mediterranean Sea. Everyone aboard was killed. Among the dead were 2 critical personnel, the deputy lead navigator and the lead navigator himself. These weren't just ordinary crew members. They were the men trained to guide the entire armada to the target. They had studied the routes, memorized the landmarks, practiced the approach, and now they were at the bottom of the sea. The loss rippled through the formation. Other aircraft developed problems. 10 more Liberators turned back, whether from mechanical issues or crew decisions we'll never know for certain. Radio silence was being maintained, so there was no way to coordinate, no way to adjust. The formation was already compromised, and they hadn't even left North African airspace yet. The route took them across the Mediterranean, over Yugoslavia. Weather entered the equation. Storm clouds loomed ahead, thick and dark. Flying through storms in tight formation is dangerous in any circumstances. In a heavily loaded bomber with strict radio silence, it's nearly suicidal. But turning back wasn't an option. They pressed on. The formations scattered in the clouds. Visibility dropped to nothing. Pilots fought to maintain control, to avoid collisions, to find their way through. When they emerged on the other side, the careful organization of the raid had disintegrated. Groups were scattered. Some were in the wrong positions. One entire group had gotten turned around and was heading toward Bucharest instead of Ploesti, and by now German radar had picked them up. The element of surprise was gone. Fighter control centres across Romania and southern Europe received alerts. Anti-aircraft batteries were manned and ready. The defenders knew something was coming. They just had to wait and see where it would strike. As the scattered formations approached Ploesti, confusion reigned. Some groups couldn't find their assigned refineries. The smoke generators had been activated, obscuring the target area. Landmarks they'd studied in reconnaissance photos were invisible or unrecognizable. Without the lead navigators, without clear communication, groups made their best guesses. Some turned the wrong way. Others pressed on toward what they thought was the right target. And then the bombers descended to attack altitude, 250 feet. That's barely higher than a 20-story building. At that altitude, you can see individual people on the ground. You can see the expressions on their faces. And they can see you, every detail of your aircraft, every window, every gun position. The B-24s roared in at treetop height, engines screaming, bomb bay doors opening. The defensive fire that erupted was beyond anything the crews had imagined. This wasn't the usual flak bursting at high altitude. This was point-blank fire. Anti-aircraft guns firing horizontally. Machine guns, cannon, even rifles, every weapon the defenders had was firing. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. Shells exploded at eye level. The air itself seemed to be on fire. Liberators started falling immediately. Some were hit in the engines, which caught fire and burned fiercely. Others took hits in the fuel tanks, which ruptured and ignited. The entire aircraft would be consumed by flames in seconds. Still others were simply torn apart by the sheer volume of fire. Wings would snap off, tails would separate. The broken pieces would cartwheel across the ground, exploding on impact. One bomber, shot to pieces and out of control, slammed into Ploesti's women's prison. The building collapsed, killing over 50 prisoners. For the airmen, there was no time to process what had happened, no time for anything except trying to survive the next few seconds. Bombs were falling, but the attack was chaos. At such low altitude, bombs had to be fused with very short delays, just seconds, to prevent them from exploding before the attacking aircraft could clear the blast zone. But this created a new problem. The attack waves were close together. Bombs dropped by the first aircraft were exploding just as the second and third waves flew over. Liberators were flying through the explosions caused by their own bombs. Shrapnel from American bombs was shredding American aircraft. Flames shot up from hit refineries, creating walls of fire hundreds of feet high. Liberators flew through these flames. Crews could feel the heat through the fuselage, paint blistered, fuel ignited. One after another, bombers emerged from the smoke and flames, some still flying, others already dying, trailing fire, losing altitude, doomed. The survivors turned for home, but the nightmare wasn't over. Hundreds of enemy fighters were in the air now, Mi-10-9s, FW-19s, Romanian fighters, all converging on the retreating bombers. The Liberators were strung out, damaged, low on ammunition. They were perfect targets. The fighters attacked in waves, diving from above, coming in from the sides, firing everything they had. Gunners in the B-24s fought back desperately. The 50-caliber machine guns hammered away until barrels glowed red-hot. Shell casings littered the interior of the aircraft. The smell of cordite mixed with burning oil and hydraulic fluid. Men screamed warnings over the intercom. Fighters attacking from 3 o'clock. Fighters from 9 o'clock. Fighters everywhere. Parachutes began appearing in the sky. White canopies bloomed as men bailed out of stricken aircraft. Some parachutes deployed successfully. Others didn't, their owners falling like stones. Some men jumped from aircraft that were already on fire, their flight suits burning. They'd rather die in the fall than burn alive. The choice between two horrible deaths. Aircraft that were too damaged to maintain altitude began descending. Some attempted forced landings in fields. The B-24's tricycle landing gear made belly landings particularly difficult. The aircraft would hit hard, bounce, tumble. Sometimes the crew survived. More often, the bomber would break apart on impact, or the fuel tanks would rupture and ignite, immolating everyone inside. By the time the survivors limped back to Libya, the butcher's bill was staggering. 73 B-24s were gone. Not damaged, not missing, gone. Destroyed, scattered across Romania in burning pieces. Over 500 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The lucky ones were the ones who died quickly. The wounded often faced agonizing journeys back to base in damaged aircraft with minimal medical supplies. The captured faced years in prisoner of war camps if they survived the initial detention. And what had been accomplished? Intelligence assessments came in over the following days and weeks. Yes, the refineries had been hit. Yes, there was damage. But within weeks, production was back to normal. Within months, output was actually higher than before the raid. The Germans and Romanians had simply worked around the clock to repair the damage. They'd brought in crews, equipment, materials. The strategic objective, the whole reason for the mission, had failed. Ploesti became a symbol. For the military, it was a lesson in the limits of strategic bombing, proof that even the most daring raids couldn't guarantee results. For the men who flew bombers, it was a nightmare made real, confirmation that courage and determination couldn't overcome bad planning and mechanical limitations. For the families waiting back home, it was telegrams and folded flags and the terrible realization that their sons and husbands and fathers were never coming back. The survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They remembered the flames, the explosions, the tracer fire, the sound of their friends screaming over the intercom as their aircraft went down. They remembered watching parachutes fail to open. They remembered the smell of burning fuel and flesh. They remembered things they could never speak about, things that would wake them up decades later, sweating and shaking. But the war didn't stop for grief or trauma. The factories kept producing liberators. The replacement crews kept arriving. The mission boards kept posting new targets. The wheel of war ground onward, consuming men and machines with mechanical efficiency. And the B-24 Liberator, for all its flaws and all its broken promises, remained at the center of the American bombing campaign. Through 1944, liberators filled the skies over Europe. They struck at rail yards in France, trying to disrupt German logistics before the D-Day invasion. They pounded industrial plants in the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. They went back to Ploesti again and again, determined to finish what they'd started. Each mission cost lives. Each mission sent young men into skies filled with steel and fire. The patterns became grimly familiar. A mission would be briefed. Crews would gather in the pre-dawn darkness, stomachs tight with fear. They'd climb into their aircraft, engines would start, the formation would assemble. They'd climb to altitude, oxygen masks on, temperatures dropping far below zero. The fighter escorts would join them, P-47s or P-51s, offering some protection but never enough. The approach to the target would be marked by increasing flak. First a few scattered bursts, then more, then a sky filled with black smoke puffs, each one representing an explosion that could kill you. The aircraft would shake from near misses. Shrapnel would punch through the thin aluminum skin. Instruments would shatter. Hydraulic fluid would spray. Oil would stream from damaged engines. And then the bomb run itself, straight and level, no evasive action allowed because the bombardier needed a stable platform to aim. Longest minutes of your life, flying straight while every gun in Germany seemed to be shooting at you. The bombs would drop. The aircraft would leap upward, suddenly lighter. The pilot would bank away, trying to get out of the kill zone as quickly as possible. But getting away from the target didn't mean safety. It meant running a gauntlet of fighters all the way back to England or Italy or North Africa. It meant nursing damaged engines. It meant watching fuel gauges drop and praying you had enough to make it home. It meant listening to wounded crew members crying for help and knowing there was nothing you could do for them, not here, not now, not at 25,000 feet with 3 hours of flying still ahead. Some missions, a dozen aircraft wouldn't come back. Some missions, 50. The men who returned would land, exhausted, traumatized, and do it all again the next day or the day after. They'd attend memorial services for crews that had gone down. They'd box up personal effects to send home to families. They'd write letters, trying to explain to grieving mothers and wives what their son or husband had meant to them, how bravely they'd died, even when the truth was they'd burned alive or been blown to pieces. In the Pacific, the story paralleled Europe's, but with its own unique horrors. The distances were even greater. Missions could last 10, 12, 14 hours. Crews would sit in cramped positions for the entire duration, muscles cramping, bladders bursting, cold beyond description. They'd fly over endless ocean, nothing but blue water from horizon to horizon. If something went wrong out here, there was no friendly territory to reach, no emergency landing fields. There was just the ocean. The targets were Japanese bases scattered across thousands of islands. Places with names most Americans had never heard of and couldn't pronounce. Truk, Leyte, Mindanao, Rabaul. Each one defended by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns, each one requiring hours of flight over hostile territory. When liberators took damage over these targets, the crews faced agonizing decisions. Try to make it back to base, knowing every mile meant more fuel consumed, more chance of engines failing. Or ditch closer to the target in waters where Japanese boats patrolled and the chance of rescue was minimal. The ditching statistics were grim. Most crews who ditched didn't survive. The B-24 would hit the water hard, break apart and sink. Those who made it out would find themselves in the water, often injured, always in shock. They'd have life rafts if they were lucky, just life vests if they weren't. Then it was a matter of waiting. Waiting for rescue that might never come, waiting while sharks circled, waiting while the sun burned them and thirst drove them mad. Some were rescued after hours in the water, some after days, some after weeks, barely alive, sunburned, delirious, damaged in ways that would never fully heal. Many were never found at all. They were simply listed as missing, lost at sea, location unknown. Their families would receive telegrams saying missing in action, and would spend years wondering, hoping, torturing themselves with the possibility that maybe their son or husband was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. The mechanical issues continued to plague operations in both theatres. Engines that should have been reliable would fail without warning. One moment they'd be running smoothly. The next, a connecting rod would break or a cylinder would crack, and suddenly you'd have a dead engine and a 1,000-pound weight hanging off your wing. Hydraulic systems would malfunction, making it impossible to lower landing gear or operate gun turrets. Electrical failures would knock out instruments, leaving pilots flying blind. And always, there was the fuel system problem. Those tanks that were supposed to seal themselves when hit didn't always work as advertised. Fuel would leak. The smell would fill the aircraft, making everyone nauseous, making everyone terrified because they knew that all it would take was one spark, one hot piece of metal, one electrical short, and the whole aircraft would become an inferno. The crews developed their own folklore, their own superstitions. Lucky aircraft that always came back. Unlucky aircraft that seemed cursed. Crews would refuse to fly in certain bombers if they had a choice. They'd wear the same clothes on every mission, carry the same lucky charms. They'd develop elaborate rituals, anything to feel like they had some control over their fate, even though deep down they knew it was all random, all luck, all a matter of being in the wrong place when a shell exploded or a fighter attacked. The psychological toll was enormous. Men would break down, unable to fly anymore. They'd develop what was then called combat fatigue, what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. They'd shake uncontrollably. They'd have nightmares. They'd freeze up at critical moments. The military tried to provide support, but in an era that didn't really understand mental health, the options were limited. Some men were sent home. Some were given desk jobs. Some were simply expected to push through and keep flying, and through it all the liberators kept flying. Because they had to, because the strategy demanded it, because stopping wasn't an option. The theory of strategic bombing said that if you hit the enemy's industrial capacity hard enough, often enough, you'd destroy their ability to wage war. The factories producing tanks would be destroyed. The refineries producing fuel would be destroyed. The rail networks moving supplies would be destroyed. Eventually, the entire war machine would grind to a halt. It was a theory. Whether it worked or not remains debated to this day. What's not debatable is the cost. 30,000 Americans died in B-24s. Not in combat with enemy soldiers on the ground. Not in naval battles. In the air, flying bombers that were supposed to protect them but often couldn't. The B-24 had specific design flaws that made it more dangerous than it should have been. The Davis wing, for all its aerodynamic efficiency, was structurally weak. It couldn't absorb battle damage. When a B-17 took a hit to the wing, the thick wing spars and multiple structural members would often hold together. The aircraft would stay in the air. When a B-24 took a similar hit, the wing would fail. The aircraft would roll, dive, disintegrate. The fuel system was another critical flaw. Self-sealing fuel tanks were supposed to prevent catastrophic fires. But the sealing mechanism had to work perfectly, and in the B-24 it often didn't. Leaks would develop, fuel vapor would fill compartments, and when ignition occurred, the results were horrific. Men would be burned alive before they could reach the exits. The lucky ones would die from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. The control systems were heavy, requiring enormous physical effort to operate. This wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Tired pilots make mistakes. Pilots whose muscles are screaming with fatigue can't react quickly to emergencies. The heavy controls contributed to many accidents, many crashes, many deaths that had nothing to do with enemy action. The emergency exits were poorly designed. In theory, a crew could evacuate a B-24 in seconds. In practice, getting 10 men out through small hatches while the aircraft was spinning or burning or both was nearly impossible. The 9-inch catwalk through the bomb bay was a death trap. Men would try to cross it while wearing parachutes and bulky flight gear. They'd slip. They'd fall. If the bomb bay doors were open, they'd fall straight through, and the fall would kill them before they could deploy their parachute. All of these flaws were known. Reports came back from combat units. Crews reported the problems. Mechanics documented the failures. Engineers proposed modifications. But changing the design meant stopping production, retooling factories, testing new configurations. That would take time, and time was something the military didn't think it had. So the production continued. 18,500 B-24s, most of them with the same fundamental design flaws that killed so many crews. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than half of all B-24s ever built were gone. Think about that statistic. Of 18,500 aircraft produced, over 9,000 were destroyed. Some in combat, some in accidents, some simply worn out and scrapped. But each one that went down in combat took its crew with it, 10 men per aircraft, and the math becomes horrifying. The Liberator had accomplished things no other bomber could. It had closed the Atlantic Gap, turning the tide against the U-boats. It had struck targets deep in Germany and across the Pacific that were beyond the range of other aircraft. It had dropped more bombs, flown more missions than almost any other aircraft in the war. Its contribution to victory was real and significant, but its legacy is complicated, painful. For every mission that succeeded, there were crews that didn't come home. For every target destroyed, there were burning aircraft falling from the sky. For every strategic objective achieved, there were telegrams delivered to families, telling them their son or husband or father was gone. The men who flew the B-24 knew what they were getting into, at least in theory. They'd trained, they'd been briefed, they understood the dangers. But understanding danger intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are different things. You can know that missions are dangerous. You can't really know what it's like to watch a bomber next to you explode until it happens. You can't know what it's like to feel shrapnel punch through the fuselage inches from your head until you experience it. You can't know what it's like to smell burning flesh until you do. Many of these men were barely adults, 19, 20, 21 years old. They'd been in high school a year or two earlier. Now they were flying into combat, facing death every time they took off. The psychological burden was crushing. They'd see friends die. They'd see aircraft go down with no parachutes, knowing everyone aboard was dying right in front of them. They'd hear screams over the radio as crews called out that they were hit, that they were going down, please remember them, tell their families they loved them. And then they'd land, if they were lucky, and the next day they'd do it all again. Because their tour wasn't complete, because the mission count hadn't been reached, because the war wasn't over. Day after day, mission after mission, until either they completed their tour or they didn't. Until either they went home or they joined the statistics. The families back home lived with constant dread. Every knock on the door could be a telegram. Every phone call could be the one bringing terrible news. They'd write letters and mail packages and pray, even though they knew prayer couldn't stop flak shells or fighter attacks. They'd scan casualty lists published in newspapers. They'd listen to radio reports about bombing missions, trying to figure out if their son or husband had been on that raid, if he'd made it back. When the telegrams did come, when families learned that their loved one wasn't coming home, the grief was compounded by the lack of closure. Many B-24 crews were never recovered. Aircraft went down over the ocean, or in remote areas, or in enemy territory. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Just a name on a memorial wall and the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there, in a field in Germany or at the bottom of the Pacific, their son was lying in the wreckage of a bomber. The war ended in August of 1945. Victory in Europe had come in May. Victory in Japan followed in August after the atomic bombs. The shooting stopped. The dying stopped. And suddenly, the military had thousands of B-24s it didn't need anymore. Aircraft that had been essential, that factories had worked around the clock to produce, were now surplus. What happened next was remarkably swift and remarkably brutal. Within a year, almost all the B-24s were gone. They weren't preserved. They weren't stored for future use. They were scrapped, melted down, turned into aluminum ingots that would be used for peacetime products. Scrapyards stretched for miles, filled with row after row of liberators waiting to be cut apart. Aircraft that had flown to Germany, that had crossed the Pacific, that had survived dozens of combat missions, were being reduced to raw material. Only a handful survived. A few ended up in museums. A few were converted for civilian use. Out of 18,500, maybe a dozen still exist today in airworthy condition. The rest are gone, erased almost as completely as the men who flew them. This erasure was intentional in a way. The military wanted to move forward, not backward. The B-24 represented an older era, an older way of war. New bombers were coming, jet bombers that would make the piston-engine aircraft obsolete. There was no sentimentality, no sense that these aircraft should be preserved for history. They were tools, and when tools are no longer needed, they're discarded. But for the men who'd flown them, the memory couldn't be discarded. The survivors came home carrying experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some could talk about it. Some couldn't. Some tried to forget, to bury the memories and move on. Some couldn't stop remembering, couldn't escape the nightmares, couldn't forget the faces of friends who'd died. They remembered specific things. The smell of the aircraft, a mixture of hydraulic fluid and sweat and fear. The sound of the engines, a roar that would leave your ears ringing for hours after you landed. The cold, so intense at high altitude that even with heated flight suits, men would get frostbite. The way the aircraft would shudder when flak burst nearby. The particular sound machine guns made when fired inside the fuselage, a hammering that you felt in your chest as much as heard. They remembered moments of terror. The fighter attack that came out of nowhere. The engine that caught fire. The moment when you realized the aircraft was going down and you had seconds to decide whether to try to bail out or stay with the aircraft. They remembered acts of courage, gunners who kept firing even when wounded, pilots who held stricken aircraft steady long enough for their crews to escape, navigators who guided damaged bombers home through sheer determination and skill. They remembered small kindnesses too. The crew chief who'd stayed up all night fixing an engine so they could fly the next day. The Red Cross volunteer who'd given them coffee and a smile before a mission. The fellow crew member who'd shared his last cigarette or told a joke that broke the tension. These small human moments amid the mechanical horror of industrial warfare. For their families, the B-24 was a ghost that hung over everything. It was the thing that had taken their son or husband or father. It was the subject of official letters written in bureaucratic language that tried to sanitize the horror. We regret to inform you that your son is missing in action following a bombing mission over Germany. What that meant was he'd fallen from the sky in flames, or drowned in the ocean, or was blown apart by flak. But official letters didn't say those things. They used euphemisms that spared the military discomfort, but left families with terrible images to imagine. Mothers and wives and children were left with photos. Young men in uniform, smiling, looking impossibly young. Sometimes there were group photos, the whole crew posed in front of their aircraft. 10 men who'd trained together, flown together, died together. These photos would sit on mantels and in frames, silent reminders of what had been lost. The recognition of what these men had done came slowly. Immediately after the war, there was relief that it was over, gratitude for victory, but also a desire to move on. The country wanted to focus on the future, on prosperity, on building the post-war world. Veterans came home and were expected to readjust, to get jobs, to start families, to act like the war hadn't changed them fundamentally. Only decades later did people begin to really grapple with what the bomber crews had experienced. Books were written, documentaries were made, reunions were held. Old men would gather, wearing caps that identified them as B-24 veterans, and they'd share stories they'd kept silent for decades. They'd cry together, remembering friends who'd never gotten the chance to grow old, to have children and grandchildren, to experience peacetime. The B-24 Liberator today exists mostly in these memories and in a few museums. The handful of airworthy examples that still fly do so as flying memorials. When they take to the air at air shows, when those four engines roar to life and the aircraft climbs into the sky, they're not just demonstrating an old airplane. They're honouring the 30,000 men who died in these machines. They're reminding people of a sacrifice that's easy to forget in an era where warfare looks completely different. Because the costs of the B-24 weren't just measured in dollars or production statistics. They were measured in human lives, in futures erased, in families broken. Every one of those 30,000 men had dreams. Maybe they wanted to be doctors or teachers or farmers. Maybe they wanted to get married, have children, grow old. The war took all of that away. The B-24, the machine that was supposed to liberate the world, became for them a flying coffin. This is the paradox at the heart of the Liberator's story. It was an essential weapon. It helped win the war. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its flaws and controversies, contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The B-24 played a crucial role in that campaign, but it also consumed the lives of the men who flew it at a rate that's shocking even when you know the statistics. The question that haunts the story is whether it had to be this way. Could the design have been better? Could the flaws have been fixed? Could more men have been saved? The answer is probably yes, but also probably no. Yes, the design could have been improved. But improving it would have meant slowing production, and the military pressure was always to produce more, faster. The generals wanted numbers, and the B-24 gave them numbers. Fixing the flaws would have reduced those numbers, and that was unacceptable. So the compromise was made, usually unstated, rarely acknowledged. The aircraft would be produced with known flaws because fixing them would take too long and cost too much, and the men who flew them would pay the price. Some would survive, many wouldn't. But the mission would go forward. The bombs would fall. The war would be won. And if the cost in human life was high, well, that was war. That was sacrifice. That was the price of victory. 75 years later, it's easy to judge those decisions from the comfort of peace. It's easy to say they should have done things differently, should have prioritized crew safety over production numbers. But the people making those decisions in the early 1940s were facing an existential threat. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. Imperial Japan had seized vast territories across Asia and the Pacific. The outcome of the war was far from certain. Delays could mean defeat. Production problems could cost the war. So they made the hard choices, the terrible choices. They sent men into the sky in aircraft they knew were flawed. They ordered missions they knew would result in massive casualties. They accepted loss rates that would be considered criminal in any modern military. And they justified it by pointing to the greater good, to the necessity of victory, to the fact that losing the war would be even worse than the terrible price being paid to win it. Whether that justification holds up is something each person has to decide for themselves. What's not debatable is the human cost. 30,000 Americans, 30,000 young men who climbed into B-24s and never came home. Each one a complete universe of potential and hope erased. Each one leaving behind family and friends who would carry that loss for the rest of their lives. The B-24 Liberator, the most produced heavy bomber of World War II. A machine that embodied both the industrial might of America and the terrible human cost of total war. Its legacy is written in production statistics and mission reports, but more importantly, it's written in cemetery markers and memorial walls, in the silent spaces at family gatherings where someone should be but isn't, in the memories of old men who still wake up, sometimes hearing the roar of four engines and the burst of flak. It was a machine that promised liberation and delivered it, but at a price so high that even now, 8 decades later, the full weight of it is almost impossible to comprehend. 30,000 lives, 30,000 futures, 30,000 dreams, all sacrificed in the skies above Europe and the Pacific, in the name of victory and freedom and ending tyranny. Whether that sacrifice was worth it, whether it had to be so high, whether things could have been different, these are questions that have no easy answers. What we can do, what we must do, is remember. Remember the men. Remember their courage. Remember what they gave so that the world they left behind could be free.